But anyways, well, how's everyone doing? Good. All right. Well, there was only a few answers, so I'm going to assume everyone's well because that's what I heard. Uh, so, guys, I'm so happy to be up here. I'm so glad to be here. I do have a couple of praise reports. First off, my first praise report is I married an amazing woman named Sarah. There's supposed to be in case you've never been to church before. Yeah, see, there's supposed to be a hand clap right there. But no, and the reason why she's amazing, besides just being an awesome wife, is also it was so happy. I showed her the graphic for this morning for the Overcoming Life series that we're starting this week, and yeah, that right there. And she goes, "You know what? You know what that reminds me of?" And I go, "What?" She has my phone and we're driving, and she said, "That reminds me of the girl from Episode 7, Star Wars." And I'm like, yeah. Because, see, she didn't like Star Wars before we got started as a couple. And, like, also our Jeep Grand Cherokee is named Finn because he looks like a stormtrooper from the back, and that's the Episode 7 reference. And so I feel like I'm doing things right. I feel like I'm having a positive influence on her. But even more so, she has a positive influence on me. Also, I'm not as good as Mike is with covering the mic when I cough, so you're just going to get a whole lot of coughing this morning, so I hope that's cool. But, guys, yeah, we're starting a new series this morning, and it's going to be running for about 5 weeks, and I did it again. As Zach told you earlier, this series is going to be focused on overcoming life. Now, that might seem like a strange title for a series because, like, when Christians talk about life, usually we're talking about like, Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And life is something to be enjoyed, and it's a gift. And, we're supposed to be speaking life into things. Life has all these different connotations for believers because we use it to describe just all the good things from God a lot of times. We use it to describe what's been going on in our life and what the good things have been going on. Well, that's what we usually describe life. However, when we're talking about life over this next 5 weeks or so, what we're really discussing is the everyday process of breathing air into our lungs, operating inside of society, and generally not dying. That's what we're talking about, okay? So let's just get a few definitions straight. When we say overcoming life, we're not talking about like the life that Jesus gives us, or we're really talking about the everyday aspect of living. And when I said that, everyone got the vibe of what I was talking about. Just the overall sense of I'm waking up, I plant my feet on the floor, I get out of bed, and here's a new day. Now, we can say here's a new day several different ways, right? As Christians, some of us approach life like, it's a new day, yeah, let's get up and get at it. And some of us approach life of like, it's a new day, awesome, right? And you know who you are. When I said that, you connected with one of those descriptions, right? And guys, as Christians, we are really bad sometimes as looking at life as very binary. Because the way we view sin and the way we view God and holiness and all these other things. And yes, there is a clear line between sin and holiness. All right, we get that. And if you don't believe that, we can have a talk. And there is an absolute truth. And I'm not talking about that. But we really should be looking at sin and stuff that way. However, we let that bleed over into other parts of our life. Sometimes we are either view things as great or bad, and there's not an in-between. And guys, that's for a lot of things, that's just not the case. And our day-to-day life is like that. Some of you view life as a very pessimistic person. We view life as binary. All things are either good or evil, godly or worldly. And this attitude carries over to how we view the process of living. We see our job as either good or evil. Some of you can say amen because of your boss. Some of us view our relationships as good or evil. That person that you have to have coffee beside who always seems to show up in the break room when you do to grab coffee in the morning that you really don't like, that person is either good or evil. We don't view them as just another person. Either they're a positive or a negative influence on your day. We view morning traffic as good or evil. Guys, I experienced one of the greatest miracles that God has ever given mankind, like of all time, when I was in college. I was in my 3rd year of college. I was going to do my Field 2 observation in Harrisburg. And for some reason, I had to go around and grab something. So I left ASU and I ran all the way down Johnson into Dan Avenue. and I hit all green lights from the college all the way past Riceland. It was the most amazing thing that's ever happened to me. Like, guys, I'm not lying. Like, it's probably ranked in the top 10 moments of my entire life. Just because there's the tension that builds when you're in traffic and you start hitting green lights, right? It's like, okay, first one, cool, yeah, awesome. Second one, oh, that's really interesting. I usually get stopped by that one. And then by the time you get to that third one, the tension starts building, right? Like, could this happen? Could it really be? Could this really be happening? Is God really going to bless me like this? And then you're at the fourth light and you're like, oh, goodness. Yeah, exactly. It never does seem to happen, but when it does, it's glorious and it opens up, and you're just thanking God all the way through. It's like when you get a spot like right at the front of the line at the parking lot at Walmart. That's a Praise Jesus spot. In case you didn't know, that deserves a 5-second praise in the car. But that's the way we view life, right? We view it as good or evil. We view those things. You know, some of us are very pessimistic Christians. We view life as something to be endured until the Lord comes back. You know, very much like the old comedy series, Hee Haw, where despair and agony and me, oh my, and whatever that song was. We think about it life like that. These people, these believers, which I am one of these believers sometimes, view life as, well, if I can just hang on until Jesus comes back. If I could just eke a fingernail into heaven, it'll be fine. You know, some people who are like that, some believers who look at life as something to just be endured, agree with, I got some quotes here. Jane Austen, famous author, the sooner the party breaks up, the better. Or, life is not having been told that the man has just waxed the floor. That was by Ogden Mash, an American poet. Or by Woody Allen, one of the better directors of our time, life is divided into the horrible and the miserable. All right? That's the way some of us view life. And however, some of us are more optimistic, and usually the people who are pessimists really don't like the optimists in this. They agree with these quotes. You know, Mae West, a famous actress in the early 20th century, you only live once, but if you do it right, once is enough. People who agree with that statement view life as an adventure, and everything's A-OK, and puppy dogs, and rainbows, and everything's awesome, right? And they agree with these quotes. And we have, you're never too old to set another goal or dream another dream. That's C.S. Lewis. And then finally, probably a quote that I would like to fit into every sermon I preach, Charles Spurgeon, famous preacher, there's hardship in everything except eating pancakes. Right? And that's the way some of us view life. We're very much optimistic, and life is an adventure, and life is puppy dogs and rainbows and awesomeness just all the time. And guys, I hate to tell you this, both sides are wrong. If you are a person who wakes up every single morning, plants your feet in the ground and go, dear God, please come back today because I might be charged with capital murder, you need to reevaluate things. If you're a person who wakes up every day and everything's sunshine and rainbows and awesomeness, you need to rethink things. Because, guys, the reality is that life falls somewhere in between. Life is more complicated than good or evil, black or white. Christ followers are supposed to be joyful and love life in all of its forms and be optimistic. That is no doubt. We need to be that way. We need to be optimistic. We need to be joyful. We need to find the goodness in all things. That's what we need to be focusing on as much as possible. However, we also must realize that life, because of the introduction of sin into the world at the beginning of creation, turns life sometimes into gloom and despair and agony. And this series is looking at what believers are supposed to do when life goes sour and things go bad. Sometimes, guys, all you get is lemons. And there is no way to make lemonade because there is not any drop of sugar in sight. Sometimes things go wrong. Sometimes things go horribly wrong to the most faithful and the best of us. And some of you have been like, John, I have not had sugar to make my lemons into lemonade since I've been born. Very much, if I didn't have bad luck, I wouldn't have any luck at all. And you know what? I don't know why that happens. But we have to realize as believers, there are ways to overcome that. There's ways to overcome the death and the agony and destruction that we experience throughout our lives. And so this series is looking at what believers are supposed to do when life goes sour and things go bad, and how do we become the overcomers that are described in 1 John 4:4. And that's going to be kind of our verse that we're going to keep coming back throughout the series is 1 John 4:4. And 1 John 4:4 states, "You, dear children," it's John writing to believers, "you, dear children, are from God and have overcome them, because the one in you is greater than the one who is in the world." Now, this is a very popular verse. Some of you probably have it somewhere in your house, or you have it noted in your Bible, or you have it highlighted on your Bible app, and it's something that's reminding you. And it's an awesome verse when you start breaking it down. Now, they have overcome them. If you read back a few verses before this verses, what you see is that overcoming them is that there was a group of believers that John is writing to, and they had another group of believers who was making life miserable for them, okay? Who was making life hard. And so when we look at 1 John 4:4, we have to realize that when it says you have overcome them, it means you're going to overcome the things in your life that are making it bad. And so that's the promise that we have from God. And a promise from God is something that is not broken. It is not something that is taken lightly. When God inspired John to write this verse, he fully intended to fulfill this out, that we will be overcomers, that we will be great, that the person that we serve is greater than the one who is in the world. And so we're going to be looking at 5 different people from the Old Testament and 5 common struggles that the legendary figures from the Bible went through. We're focusing on the Old Testament because, first of all, it seems like people in the Old Testament went through a whole lot more stuff than people in the New Testament did. You have almost all of 1st and 2nd Samuel is written about David, which is who we're going to dive into this morning. And so we're going to get a feel for how people lived. And I really liked figures from the Old Testament because when you ask, what's your favorite Bible story? Most people will say someone from the Old Testament. I like Noah's Ark, or I like the story of David, or I like the story of Moses, or whatever. And so we're going to take kind of these legendary figures that the Bible presents, these people that we think are greater than we could ever be as believers. And we're going to kind of break them down and let you realize that life was not always great for them. And if you ever wonder where this series came from, Michael approached Zach and I a few weeks ago, or probably 2 months ago, and asked us to kind of start developing a series. And this was supposed to be, I preach one Sunday, Zach preaches one Sunday, done deal, we leave the table, everything's fine. And then it turned into a full series. And we really originally wanted to do it over Elijah, and we wanted to mention and talk about the struggle with depression. And how that plays into Elijah's story and everything else. And it kind of grew from there. And so we're looking at people who have these legendary kind of high-in-the-sky views of it, and we're breaking them down and realizing that they have struggles. And we have to realize that humans love a comeback story about overcoming. And that's what we'll be using this to drive forward. The harder the story, the greater the glory is what we're really looking at. And that's what we have to realize as believers, that when life gets hard, the harder things get, the greater the glory for Jesus is going to be. And so the first problem we're going to look at that we're going to be able to overcome is a tough one. We're going to be looking at moral failure. And we're going to be looking at David to describe how do we overcome moral failure. And that's the big one, guys. And moral failure is one of those things that every one of us has encountered. Every one of us is messed up. When I said everyone struggles with moral failure, you thought of something. You thought of that time that you screamed at your wife and y'all had a big fight and the neighbors had to call the police on you or whatever it may be, or had to call and go, hey, are y'all all right? Some of you might be thinking about the time that you stole money from your parents when you were a teenager. Some of you might be thinking about the time that you cheated on your taxes. We think about these things. We all have moral failures, and they mark us. They mark us deeply. It's probably one of the hardest things we have to come over because no one likes to be disappointed in. None of us like that feeling of disappointment that settles in when we mess up. And so that's what we're going to be talking about, because oftentimes what we do with moral failure is that when we sin, when we fall away from the standard that God has presented to us, and we fall away from it massively, oftentimes what we do is we let that define us. We let that go against us. We let us be condemned instead of convicted. And so we're going to be talking about how we overcome that. We're going to be looking at David. And so we have to realize that everyone's life is a testimony. Now, testimony is one of those loaded church words that oftentimes we think of a testimony of, we think of maybe a Sunday service where it's a testimony service and everyone gets up and go, well, I struggled with this week, but praise be to God, He got me through it. and we think about that things, oftentimes testimony, guys, is really just story. We all have a testimony. We all have a story to tell. We all have something that we can provide to the narrative, right? And so when we say that everyone's life is a testimony, we have to realize that we're telling a story. And so the question is this, like any good, what's going to be the thing that gets people rooting for your story? Like any good story, a testimony needs hard times and conflict to be compelling, and no one's life had a greater mix of external and internal issues than David. Now, oftentimes when I said David, you automatically think, what do we automatically think of when we think of David? Let's be honest. Goliath. He goes out with a slingshot, he hits that giant right between the eyes, drops him dead, and everything's awesome. But there's a lot more to David. David's story is just beginning at that point, and we have another 60 or 70 years worth of David to go through at that point. And so David's going to mess up a whole lot. When you look at David's life, we often think of like a man after God's own heart, great warrior for God, all this different stuff. But David is going to mess up a lot. And if you would like to dive deeper into the story of David, you can find most of his story in 1 and 2 Samuel, just to let you know. And so let's talk about David. In case you don't know the story of David, I want to give you a real quick rundown, and I'm going to do it John Frank style, which is going to include a lot of pop culture references and jokes. So here we go. David has a reputation as one of everybody's favorite Bible characters. How many of you, David's your favorite character in the Bible? Let's be honest. Who we got? Come on. We got one. Jim's going to be honest. Thank you. All right, we got another one. If you don't like David, I'm sorry, something's wrong with you. He's my favorite because he has achieved the highest of things and the lowest of things. And I realize that regardless of how good I get, I will never reach the heights that David reached. And as low as I get, I will never reach the lows that David reached. And so I like the fact that I can fall somewhere in the middle with David, right? And so David, in case you don't know, he starts off his life as the younger brother of several brothers, and they live in the town of right outside of Bethlehem. He is the one, as the younger brother, of course, he gets all the awful jobs. He's the one that has to go tend the sheep. Anyone ever tended sheep before? No one? Let me give you a rundown of sheep, okay? I've never personally experienced them, but my cousin Miranda, her father, Uncle David, has, because he used to work for the Arkansas Sheriff's Youth Ranch. They are dumb as rocks. Let me give you a perfect example. They had a group of sheep that were donated to them. My Uncle David had never messed with sheep before. And they were out checking fences, him and another guy that worked for the ranch. And they pulled up and they saw a sheep struggling in the middle of a cow pond. Now, in case you have never got a wool coat wet, it is extremely heavy when it gets wet. Wool is like a sponge. It soaks up water. And so you have an untrimmed sheep out in the middle of a cow pond about to drown. And the guy asked my Uncle David, "David, what are we going to do?" He goes, "I don't know what you're going to do, but I'm about to watch a sheep drown." And he goes, "What are you talking about?" He goes, "If you go out there, that sheep weighs like 40, 50 pounds already, and then add another 50 pounds to it. Have you ever drugged something 100 pounds out of the water?" And this guy all of a sudden jumps off his horse, takes his shirt off, takes his boots off, and dives into the water after the sheep. And my Uncle David's thinking, I'm about to see two things drown this afternoon. But he gets the sheep pulled up. Well, like fast forward a week, another sheep is dropped into the same pond. Sheep are dumb. They're stinky, they're awful, and David has the blessing to get to watch sheep. So he starts off that way. And while he's out there, he decides to use the time that he's been given to do a couple things. First of all, he learns how to play the harp and how to write songs. So he's out there and he's got his harp and he's picking on his harp. I'm imagining it like a folk singer, like a banjo almost. He's out there. Someone's in a washboard in the bushes behind him, just going at it. Someone's got spoons. It's awesome. But he's out there and he's learning how to sing. He's learning how to play the harp. He's learning how to songwrite. But also he's getting really good with his sling. And he ends up killing a lion and a bear that are trying to kill his sheep with a sling. So, he's off to a good start. However, his older brothers join the army. They go off to war. They go off to war, and in the midst of the time they're going off to war, the king of Israel, Saul, had really ticked off God, had done something he was not supposed to do, had basically took the role of the priest and went onward. And you're not supposed to do that. And so God tells one of his prophets, Samuel, who the book is named after, 1st and 2nd Samuel, said, "You need to go anoint another king." So he goes to Jesse's house, which that's David's father, and he says, He starts going through all the sons, and eventually he comes to David, anoints David as the next king of Israel. So David's moving on up, all right? He's like the Jeffersons. He has gone from tending sheep to being the future king of Israel. The issue is this, is that there's already a king of Israel, and on top of all this, Israel is being besieged by the Philistines. And the Philistines, if you want to kind of put an idea of who they were like if you've ever watched a sitcom of like teenagers, and the bully that's in every season that never seems to graduate, even though in the original season they were like 4 years older than the person, they're always there. That's the way the Philistines are. You read all the way through the Old Testament, and the Philistines there for like 3/4 of it, okay? They are the bullies that never leave. So eventually, Israel's under siege. David goes out. He ends up, being all bad, goes Rambo on them, basically. Goes out there, defeats Goliath, who was their main champion, and people's like, yeah, this dude's amazing. And so people start following David, and he gets more and more followers. And he's this great warrior king. People are starting to chant as Saul comes into town, the king of Israel during this time period. They're chanting, well, Saul's killed thousands and David's killed tens of thousands. And Saul is not a humble person. And he decides it's time to get rid of this kid. Which also, if you want to know a messed up storyline, it was his son's best friend. David and his son were best friends. So if you've ever had the annoying kid, parents, at your house that you don't really like, that your kid's best friends with, and you're just like, I would really like to do physical harm to that child, Saul actually did. So David goes on the run, and he's out in the wilderness for several years. And he's on the run, and he's gathering in people around him, and eventually Saul ends up dying. And Saul ends up dying, and David becomes king. And guys, David has a huge reputation as people's favorite Bible character, and for good reason. He's described as a man after God's own heart. We're the only person in the Bible to do so. He defeated a giant. He was the greatest warrior in Israelite history. He apparently was good looking according to the Bible. When it describes David at first, it said he was ruddy and good looking. He was a songwriter and musician. He was anointed king of Israel before the age of 18. He is a descendant of Jesus, Jesus is a descendant of David. David, if you're going to put a list of what you would want a Bible character to be, David's it, all the way around. And David's life is a fairy tale, but it's a fairy tale because it was his dedication to God. We are successful when we fully depend on God, even when hard times come. We are victorious when we fully depend on God, even when we feel defeated. We have to realize that David's success doesn't come from his own merit. Yes, God gave him the ability to fire a slingshot off, and it's awesome. God gave him the ability and gave him the good looks that David was known for. He gave David the ability to be a great leader of men. But see, what the common theme is that God gave it. But not only did God give those things, David recognized that God had given him those things. Oftentimes when we're looking to live a righteous life, we oftentimes get caught in that pride trap of like, well, I have the ability to sing, or I have the ability to speak, or I have the ability to be creative, or I have the ability to connect with people on a personal level really quick. And it should always be with a believer who's trying to live a righteous life. God. God gave me this ability. And that's what David does. For the first part of his life, David puts everything in the hands of God. When we depend on God, we are successful. Even when hard times come, we are victorious. Even when it feels like we're defeated. When we depend on God, we're Rocky at the end of Rocky 2. We're Luke Skywalker at the end of New Hope. We're every single good Disney character at the end of every single Disney film. We're on top of the world. Or in Rocky's case, on top of those steps. Training montage. The lesson we can learn is that rooting ourselves in holiness only comes from our recognition of needing God to redeem everything in our lives. I hate to break it to you, but everything that we do, everything that we accomplish is nothing compared to what God does. The thing is, though, is that we think we create things and we do awesome things, but what we have to realize is that we are artists drawing on a borrowed canvas. We are artists drawing on a borrowed canvas. God has given us the ability to do these things. And we have to recognize that. 2 Timothy chapter 1 verse 9 says, He has saved us and called us to a holy life, not because of His own purpose and grace. This grace was given to us in Christ Jesus before the beginning of time. The great thing about David, and the thing I find great, is that even if Samuel had never come knocking, David would have still been a man after God's own heart. If Samuel had never showed up and David had tended sheep until he died, he would have still been a man after God's own heart. And oftentimes what we do when we think of living a righteous life is that we think that we're supposed to rise to an elder in the church, and we're supposed to be a leader of a hospitality team or a leader of a worship team, or we're supposed to do this or that. And oftentimes we feel like failures when we don't accomplish that. But the great thing about God is that God has as much respect for what Jim does, leading worship on Sunday mornings, as He does for someone who prays for Jim in the privacy of their own home every single day. God does not respect what we find important. He respects our heart, and He respects what we do and how we put things towards Him. However, even a person after God's own heart stumbles. And the question of this is, how do we respond to moral failure? And that's what we're really going to dive into today. See, David eventually sins, and he sins big time. Like if you read the first several chapters of when it talks about David, David's on a roll. Like he is hitting a solid 450. That's a baseball reference in case you don't know. That's really good. He's hitting 450 before the All-Star break. Everything's going wonderful. His on-base percentage is great, though he's a great teammate. He's like Derek Jeter on steroids, which kills me to say because I'm a Red Sox fan and he was a Yankees player, but whatever. Derek Jeter in his prime, not the last couple of years, so you can throw those away. But anyways, he's awesome. He's doing wonderful. He is on track to have like the greatest life that a godly person has ever had, like ever. Like he is on track, and then things go horribly wrong. Things go horribly wrong. When David fails morally and sins, David seems to do it to the best of his abilities. And guys, that's the way we do it. I don't know about you, but when I mess up big time. It's not a small thing. It's not a small stumble. It's I've tripped. I have busted out a couple of teeth. I need to go to the dentist. This is awful. Something horrible has happened. And we must come to the realization that if we as Christians hold ourselves and others to a perfect standard, then we will be sorely disappointed in ourselves, others, and ultimately God. If we always think that I have to be perfect, people have to be perfect, we're not only going to become irritated ourselves, we're not only going to become irritated at others, but also we're going to be irritated at God, because God, why are you letting us fail? Why are you allowing us to stumble? Aren't we serving you? And we get really mad at God. The first step to realizing all this stuff, to overcoming moral failure, is to realize that everyone fails morally. Let's be honest. In the last week, how many of you have sinned? Raise your hand. And guess what? If you didn't raise your hand, you can chalk it up because you just sinned by lying. Gotcha. Here's the thing, guys. We realize if you follow after God, you will fail. The difference between a Christ follower and everyone else is that a non-believer is in a constant state of failure. Everyone else is in a constant state of failure. And the reason for this is that we have a standard bearer. We have Jesus. We have to realize that one of the only things that separates believers from non-believers is that we realize we're sinning. And that's because we've been given a vision of Christ to compare ourselves to. And so realize, I want you to take a breath and realize you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to have it all together. You've messed up. I've messed up. Jim's messed up. Zach's messed up. Not by wearing that shirt, because that shirt's awesome. See? But we're all doing good, right? We're all doing good when we realize that we have done bad. And so, the most interesting thing about David is that his eventual fall does not come under hard times when he is surrounded by threats of death and banishment, but when he's comfortable. This is why I love David, is that, a lot of times we think people stumble and fall when they're under pressure and when things have gone bad, when they've lost the job, the house is about to be foreclosed upon, the dog is sick, everything's going wrong. That's when we think people fail. But what's really crazy is that our logic doesn't really line up with the way humans behave, is because, guys, I've seen people who have been their most faithful, their most joyful, their most patient when hard times have come. David doesn't fail morally when he's about to be killed in the wilderness. He doesn't fail when he is on his run, on the run for his life because of Saul. He fails when he is comfortable. And when we get comfortable in our spiritual life, when we walk away from that stuff, we have to realize that we are in really prime territory to fail morally and fail hard. So David finally becomes king over all of Israel. He achieved his goal. He does a great job at first. He wins lots of victories. He brings the Ark of the Covenant back into Jerusalem, which, if you don't know what the Ark of the Covenant was, it's basically the physical representation of God for the Israelites and for the Jews during this time period. He brings it back into Jerusalem. Everything's going wonderful. He builds some walls around Jerusalem to protect them from people coming on the outside. Things are going great for David. He restores relationships with what is left over of Saul's family. Guys, if he was president, his approval rating would be like in the 70s or 80s, which is a big deal. If you're wondering, though, that's about twice as much of where the last couple presidents have been, just to let you know. He is doing wonderful, right? He is doing wonderful. However, the good times eventually stop because David, the man after his God's own heart, the warrior poet, the king of Israel, fails. And not slightly, but like, I haven't paid the electric bill in 3 months and the lights just went off type of failure. Everyone's had that moment, right? Oh, I forgot to pay the electric bill. Oops. The internet bill did not come out. Why can't I look at Facebook? That moment we're like, oh, I was supposed to do something and I didn't do it. That's the moment that happens. The story of David, more than anything else, illustrates that anyone can slip into sin. Temptation is no respecter of persons. Every person, from the most prolific Christian in the world down to a new believer who's only been a believer for a day, is tempted. And they're tempted in the same manner. They're tempted with the same intensity that it happens. It's an everyday thing that temptation happens. James chapter 1 verses 13 through 14 says, "When tempted, no one should say, 'God is tempting me.' For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone." And this is the part I want us to notice. "But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed." And I love the verbiage on that. Dragged away. I get the image of someone digging their fingers like on the horror movies into the ground, and they're drug away, and you can just see the finger marks all the way down. That's what it says we are. What does it say? It doesn't say we're drug away by Satan. It doesn't say we're drug away by demons. It says we're drug away by what? Our own evil desires, and we're enticed. Guys, everyone has evil desires. Everyone has desires that don't line up with what God wants to have happen. Everyone has the desire to yell at the person in traffic when you didn't get the miracle and the lights changed too fast. Okay? Everyone has that. We're drug away by our own evil desires. And so, guys, we're about to go through and we're about to see David's fall. And what's really crazy is that it's in 2 Samuel chapter 11. We're going to have it up here on the screen, parts of it. But if you want to read the whole thing, you can get on your Bible and read it. But what's really crazy when we read through this, you're going to see, it's like a slow motion, like if you were able to film a Jenga tower collapsing in slow motion, this is what it would look like. You can see the falling, okay? So 2 Samuel chapter 11, verses 1 through 5 says this. "In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war," notice that, "David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of his palace. And from the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, 'She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite.' And then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. Now she was purifying herself from her monthly uncleanness. Then she went back home. The woman conceived and sent word to David saying, 'I am pregnant.'" So, let's break this down of why it's bad. We focus on the last part. He got someone who was not his wife pregnant. He committed adultery and got someone else pregnant. Okay? But it starts before that. His sin, David's sin, does not start when he commits the sin of adultery. It doesn't start when he lusts after the woman when he sees her bathing naked on the roof next to his roof. It starts even before that. I want you to notice, he's not fulfilling his kingly duties. Verse 1. "In the spring at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army." Fast forward a little bit. "But David remained in Jerusalem." He doesn't go out with his army like he's supposed to. He doesn't fulfill his kingly duties. That's the first thing that is leading to his sin. The next thing is this, is that Uriah. So he's sinned, he's figured out all this stuff. Uriah, you wonder why he mentions Uriah the Hittite like it's a big deal. It's because it is. You know when I told you that David was on the run from Saul because he thought he was going to die? Uriah was one of the first guys that joined David's army and was like one of his closest supporters. As a matter of fact, Uriah is a member of what's called the 30. And the 30 were like David's Special Forces elite group. They were like the SEALs, the Rangers, and the Green Berets all rolled into one. And these dudes are from everywhere. They're from outside of Israel. Some of them actually had to convert to Judaism, which if you know the physical requirement to convert to Judaism during this time, you realize that these are some bad dudes. All right? All the way around. And Uriah is one of them. It talks about, as a matter of fact, a few months ago when Mike was preaching on, Mike was preaching about Chase the Lion series. In that set of verses, when it's talking about, the guy going into the pit and killing the lion, in that same set of verses, it talks about Uriah just wrecking people. Uriah is one of his closest supporters, one of his closest advisors, possibly one of his closest friends. David's already so far down the hole of temptation that he's lusting after this woman that's not his wife, and then he asks, who is she? And he is informed that it's Uriah's wife. And he's still like, bring her to me. Guys, oftentimes when we don't fulfill our duties, as Christians, getting into the Word, getting into prayer, getting into community, we will start doing things that we never thought possible once we became saved. And it's because we stopped doing our duties. You see David's mind slipping and his resolve slipping away. And get this, he isolates himself from everyone. He has these temptations. He doesn't go to his wife and say, listen, I've been having these temptations and I need you to help me. He doesn't go to the priest and go, listen, this is some really bad stuff. Would you please pray to God on my behalf? He doesn't go to his military commander and say, listen, I need you to put me out on the front lines. Tell me where I need to be at. He doesn't do any of that. Instead, he isolates himself. It says he's walking alone on his roof and he goes and gets someone to go get her. He's out there on his own. Guys, if this was a movie, it's like the Titanic when Leonardo DiCaprio was on the front of the boat and he's like, I'm the king of the world. But imagine if David's on that point right at this moment. He's king of Israel. He's amazing. And then the moment that this starts happening, it's like Leonardo DiCaprio hitting a wet spot and falling over the front edge, just bloop. That's where David's at. He's doing wonderful and now he's not. Guys, there are steps to moral failure. And this is what's going to save some of us from really falling into a deep, deep sin, is that if we'll recognize these steps. First of all, number one, David starts falling away from his purpose. David isn't on purpose during this time. His focus is gone. He is content with wanting other people to go do the work for him. Guys, what got him to the place where he was is that he went out with soldiers. David was known to be fearless. He charged into battle first and let soldiers follow behind him. He was the one who stepped in front of Goliath. But when it comes time to go out to war, when he's king, what does David stop doing? He stops fighting. He stops going after it hard. He stops being tenacious. He wants other people to do it for him. And the same happens to us. When we aren't in our word, when we aren't in prayer, when we aren't telling people about Christ, when we aren't engaging in community, we are setting ourselves up for moral failure. And guys, I get it. It's hard. It is a hard thing to be on task every single day when it comes to Christ. It is a hard thing to deny yourself every single day. It is an incredibly hard thing to put away pride, to put away anxiety, to put away fear, to put away reputation, to put those things away and be real with people and be real with God. That is a thing, Paul in the New Testament even goes as far to saying is that I die daily. I crucify my flesh daily. This is a hard thing. Dying to yourself is a hard thing, but when we stop doing it, it'll snowball. Anyone ever not picked weeds out of a garden for 3 or 4 days, a week? And then all of a sudden, the garden's more weeds than it is crops. Anyone ever had that moment? Yeah. My mom and dad are here, and when I was growing up, we tried to grow a garden a couple of different times out beside our house, and I've realized that the whole family has black thumbs. Just don't let us near plants. It's just awful all the way around. But it got out of hand quick, didn't it, Mama? Yeah. All the way around. It can happen quick. And it's the same way with our own lives. When we're not being diligent in what we're doing, we'll completely ruin what God has supplied for us already. The second thing that happens, the second step to having a moral failure is the second look. We should never feel condemned about being tempted. Even Jesus was tempted. How many of you, even if you have a temptation, you feel bad about it? Let's be honest. How many of you will pray? You will pray over and over again about you didn't even give in to the temptation, but you are condemned about the temptation itself. Guys, that's not Jesus. Jesus does not call to condemn. He calls to convict. And He does not convict when you're just tempted. Jesus Himself was tempted. We have to realize that. And that's another tool that Satan uses, that the enemy uses to get off plan, is that he makes us feel bad just for thinking about doing something. You know, there's an old pastor saying, you can't help if a bird lands on your head, but you can keep him from building a nest there. Same way with temptation. We can't help when tempting thoughts pop into our head, but we can make sure that they don't stay there. But see, David doesn't take that advice. David doesn't turn from being tempted. Look at verse 2. One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. So get this. There's two looks here. The woman is bathing on the roof, semicolon, and she was very beautiful. Guys, I don't know about you, but if I'm spotting someone from a distance, I recognize, oh, there's a person over there. But it takes me a second to realize if I know that person or not. It takes a second look. For David to realize that not only is this woman naked on a roof, but also that she is beautiful, that takes two looks. David couldn't have helped. He shouldn't have ever been on the roof in the first place because he should have been out with his army. But when he's out on the roof, he looks out. He can't help if he sees a woman bathing. He's out looking across Jerusalem. There's someone bathing on a roof. Not his fault. But realizing that she is beautiful, that's a David. That's the fault. Okay? And guys, oftentimes with temptation, we'll have temptation come, and maybe we're not where we're supposed to be with God and not where we're supposed to be in our relationship with Jesus. But when that temptation comes, oftentimes we allow ourselves to take that second look. We allow ourselves to go, oh, maybe that would be cool. Maybe that would be something that I would enjoy. And that's when sin's able to take hold. And David doesn't turn away from being tempted, but he takes a second look. And what happens is this. The third step to moral failure is this. 2 Samuel chapter 11, verses 6 through 13 says, so David sent this word to Joab, send me Uriah the Hittite. So he's already in trouble. He has already sinned. He's committed adultery. He's got Bathsheba pregnant. And now David is scrambling like every one of us does when we sin and when we screw up really bad. How can I make this go away? So he has the brilliant idea. I'll get Uriah to come back home. He's a soldier who hasn't seen his wife in a few months. They will fulfill their marital bed. It'll look like she was pregnant because of Uriah. Uriah, awesome. I'm off the hook. So he goes and tells Moab to bring Uriah the Hittite off the field. Uriah came to him, and David asked him how Joab was and how the soldiers were and how the war was going. David's playing it cool like we do with sin. We're trying to cover it up. Then David said to Uriah, go down to your house and wash your feet. And so Uriah left the palace, and a gift from the king was sent after him. But Uriah slept at the entrance to the palace with his master's servants and did not go down to the house. Guys, if you want to see soap opera style drama, he's trying to cover up that he's got his best friend's wife pregnant. He sends Uriah back home thinking they'll sleep together, everything's going to be cool. Uriah is such a devoted friend that he doesn't spend the night with his wife who he hasn't seen in 3 months, but he spends the night in front of David's palace, protecting David. So, go on further. David was told Uriah did not go home. And so he asked Uriah, haven't you just come home from a military campaign? Why didn't you go home? And Uriah said to David, the ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my commander Joab and my Lord's men are camped in the open country. How could I go to my own house to eat and drink and make love to my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing. Then David said to him, stay here one more day, and tomorrow I'll send you back. And so Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. Guys, sin spreads to others. It is a disease in which we have no natural born immunities. David's physical sin with Bathsheba leads to him causing one of his closest servants to sin. Because in the next verse, in verse 14, it says, at David's invitation, he ate and drank with him, and David made him drunk. But in the evening, Uriah went out to sleep on his mat among his master's servants and did not go home. David goes, all right, Uriah is a good dude. I can't blame him. He's protecting me. I'll get him drunk, and maybe he'll go home and sleep with his wife then. Guys, David trying to cover up his sin caused another follower of God to sin. We have to realize that sin is a disease, and it spreads very, very quickly if not checked. You know, throughout the New Testament, the illustration of yeast is used. A little yeast leavens the whole lump, as it says. And guys, anyone ever worked with bread? It takes just a little bit of yeast, doesn't it, to get that bread to rise? Don't need a whole lot. And guys, it was the cultural idea to not put yeast in your bread. And the fear was always that a little bit of yeast was going to find its way into the batch and it was going to cause it to rise and ruin the bread. That's the same way that sin is. Guys, we are not isolated creatures. We are made to be communal. Nothing we do, good or bad, only affects us. There is no such thing as an isolated sin. When we mess up, when we fail morally like David did, if we don't catch it, if we don't bring it before Christ, it is sure to spread to fellow believers. We are sure to hurt other believers. In 1 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul uses the idea of the human body, that we're all parts of the body. Guys, I don't know about you, but if you get sick in one part of your body, it causes symptoms everywhere else, correct? It's the same way with our sin. A sin buried in the deepest secretly will still have symptoms rise to the surface. It doesn't matter how well you think you have that sin kept, that how well I think I have my sin kept up. If I keep it there, it will rise to the surface. Your hatred of your next door neighbor, that bitterness will spread to how your kids view people. The way our addiction to pornography will affect how we see our spouse and how your spouse views herself and views you. Our gossip towards other people impacts how our friends see fellow Christians. Your sin, my sin, our sin does not remain secret. It affects other people. It always affects other people. 2 Samuel chapter 11, verses 14 through 16, I already read part of it. Read verse 14. He did not go home, and in the morning David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. In it he wrote, put Uriah out in front where the fighting is the fiercest. This is the turn where it gets really bad. Then withdraw from him so he will be struck down and die. And so while Joab had the city under siege, he put Uriah at a place where he knew the strongest defenders were. And when the men of the city came out and fought against Joab, some of the men in David's army fell. Moreover, Uriah the Hittite fell. Guys, and then fast forward to verse 26 through 27. It says, when Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him. And after the time of mourning was over, David had brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. Guys, David, in the course of trying to hide his sin, trying to cover up what he had done, not only causes him to fail, it causes a fellow believer to fail, and then on top of all this, it ruins the relationship of what he has with those people. Sin ruins relationships. David and Uriah's relationship was irreparably split when David was trying to get him to sleep with Bathsheba, and he wouldn't do it. David's like, well, you're not worth it to me. Go die. A woman lost her husband because David had unrepentant sin. David, notice the last verse, and the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. And the relationship between God and David was also severed. When we sin, we're in danger of severing so many different relationships. And we have to realize that. And also number 4, the fourth thing we learn from moral failure is that human action can't fix sin. Notice this, verse 27. After the time of mourning was over, David had brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. Seems like a good thing, right? David being that's the way it looks to everybody else. David being the upright king, poor woman, just lost her husband. David brought her into the palace and made her his wife, and everything was awesome and everything was good. That's how it is looking on the inside. David's trying to fix what he's done. But it doesn't work. And we move on to the next chapter, and I'm not going to read it, but let me summarize it for you. The prophet Nathan comes in before David and tells David this parable about this sheep. He talks about this guy had this beloved sheep that he loved so much, and this was a sheep that he looked after and raised and everything else. However, the rich landowner from up the street who had lots of sheep came in and demanded, because he was in power, that this guy give his sheep to him. And then he had that sheep slaughtered. And Nathan's telling this story to David, and David's furious. David's like, how dare that guy? How dare the guy who's rich take away from the poor person who only had one sheep when he has tons of sheep? David's like mad. David's like, tell me who this guy is and I'll have him killed. And Nathan goes, surprise, plot twist, it's you. And all of a sudden, David realizes what's wrong. And on top of this, Nathan goes on to say that, guess what? You're about to have a child. And that child, when it is born, is going to be sick. And it's going to die. And it's all because of you. And then David goes off and he goes into a deep depression. He goes off by himself. He does the customary thing. He puts ashes on his head. He wears this uncomfortable thing called sackcloth, which is basically like burlap. And he puts himself in basically discomfort in order to try to get God to, like, please, God, don't take my child. And he begs God for days, don't let my child die. Eventually, the child dies. No human action can fix sin. Nothing we do will be able to repair what sin damage does to us. However, we see in Numbers 32, verse 23, it talks about the fact that eventually everyone's sin will be revealed. It will find its way out. But then we'll be able to be redeemed. The great thing, not the great thing, but the good thing about sin, the silver lining, is that if we turn to Jesus, our sin might have been private, but our redemption happens in public. If we fail morally, we can follow David's example in 2 Samuel chapter 1, or chapter 12, verses 1 through 18. He weeps over his sin and its consequences. He cries out to God, please let things change. It says after he figures out that the child has died, he goes to the temple to wash himself and put himself right before God. He goes to his household and he makes relationships right with Bathsheba. He apologizes to her and they weep together is what it says. And so what we see is that if you want to be redeemed from your moral failure, if you followed those first 3 steps, if we follow those first 3 steps into moral failure, if we weren't doing what we're supposed to do, we gave the second look and then we tried to hide that sin, we can follow David's 4th example and we can open ourselves up and we can go and feel sad, feel bad for our sins. We can go before God and redeem ourselves. We can go to our household and repair our own relationships. In Psalm 51 verses 1 through 13, and we're about to close. Psalm 51 verses 1 through 13 says, have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. According to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions. Wash away all my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin, for I know my transgressions. And my sin is always before me. Against you and you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight, so that you are right in your verdict and justified when you judge. Surely I was sinful at birth, sinful from the moment my mother conceived me. Yet you desired faithfulness even in the womb. You taught me wisdom in that secret place. Cleanse me with hyssop, and I will be clean. Wash me, and I will be made whiter than snow. Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones you have crushed rejoice. Hide your face from my sins and blot out my iniquity. Create in me a pure heart, O God. Renew a steadfast spirit within me. Do not cast me from your presence or take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and grant me a willing spirit to sustain me. And then I will teach transgressors your ways, so that sinners will turn their back to you. During this entire verse, David writes this right after Nathan reveals his sin to him. David writes this entire song to basically repent for what he's done. And notice through this, David does nothing in this. It says, God, put a new spirit in me. God, cleanse me. God, turn away from my transgressions. There is nothing that David is doing to fix himself. Recovery from moral failure has nothing to do with us and everything to do with God. And what's crazy is that we have something that David did not. We have Jesus, the ultimate sacrifice. David still had to go through the law to be cleansed. He had to go kill a lamb, or he had to go kill a bull. He had to go and kill a calf. He had to do something to get his sin right with God. But we have already had that ultimate sacrifice through Christ. David didn't have the freedom that was described in Galatians in the last series that we went over. David, however, is reflecting a new covenant, a new way of doing things, a Christ-centered idea of repentance. But he did not have the most important piece. He did not have Jesus. Jesus is not only our standard bearer and our salvation, but he's also our enabler. He's our enabler to overcome life because he is the overcomer. Revelation chapter 3, verse 21 says this, "To the one who is victorious, I will give the right to sit with me on my throne, just as I was victorious and sat down with my Father on his throne." Jesus has already overcame. And because he has already overcame, we can overcome. We can overcome our moral failure. We can overcome our sin. And guys, I want us to notice something. David isn't angry with God because of the consequences of his sin. He understands it. Sometimes what we do is that we sin and we get the idea that God forgives us, but then we're mad at God because we had to face the consequences of that sin. David realizes that he is not controlling his own life anymore. He puts his life completely into God's hands, just as we're supposed to do. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 17 says, "Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come, the old is gone, the new is here." And the last thing we're going to go over, Psalm 51 has something interesting in it. So David's redeemed, he's cleansed, everything's good. But verse 13, "Then I will teach transgressors your ways, so that sinners will turn back to you." Guys, we have to understand that a redeemed heart will not only want to be a new creation, but will want others to do the same. That's what's great. If today you are struggling with moral failure, and at the response time you're able to get yourself right with God, and God is able to come down and wash that away, guess what? Not only are you redeemed, but now you can go show redemption to other people. That's right. That's what's great, is that God is not treating us like a coach who has had a player who has done something awful and they're benched until they get things right. Instead, what God does to us, he realizes that we've messed up and he puts us right back out on the playing field. He puts us right back out on the front lines, because when people see how we've been redeemed, they will want to come to Christ also. And so with that being said, as we bow our heads and we close our eyes, or as we just bow our heads, we're going to be open today as much as possible. Just as we bow our head in reverence as we enter into a response time, there are a couple things I want to ask. First of all, we're going to open these altars up. We're going to open up this section in the front for prayer here in just a second. I'm going to have a few people volunteer to come up here to pray for others. But first of all, I want to ask right now, if you're like, "John, I don't understand what you're really talking about when you're talking about moral failure. I've never had my life redeemed by Christ. I've never given my life to Jesus. I've never entered into a relationship with God through Jesus." If that's you and you would like to be a believer, if you would like to believe that God has saved you, has taken away your sins, who has made you whiter than snow, and you would like to enter into that relationship and you've never done it before, I'd like you just to raise your hand real quick. All right. The next section I'm going to talk about is this, and I'm not going to make you raise your hand, but there are two things we got to realize: that there are people in this room, just by statistics alone, who are going through a deep moral failure. You have messed up. I have messed up. We have messed up. And you need to get that right. You want to be like David in Psalm 51. You want to have that repentant heart that brings you back to Christ. Or something that we didn't talk about earlier today is this. Some of you have family or friends who have gone through a deep moral failure, who have committed adultery, who have been caught in pornography, who have been caught embezzling money from their company, who have been shown to be an alcoholic, who have been shown to be addicted to a substance, and you want to do something to help them. You want to show them the redemption of Christ. You want to be able to forgive them for the things that they've done, but you don't know how to do it. If you would fall underneath those two camps, either you are in the middle of a moral failure right now, or you have someone close to you who right now you would like to show forgiveness to and show them the way of Christ so that they might be redeemed. If that's you, please raise your hand. All right, I see those hands. What I'd like to do right now, guys, is they sing through worship. He said, if you are needing prayer for any of those things, there's going to be people down here, and I need some people to volunteer to come up. And people come up. Zach and Sarah and Hannah, would y'all mind coming up just right now? Bobby and Heather, would y'all mind coming up, please? And if that's you, if you're going through a sin right now that you can't seem to kick, and you need God to help you, or if you have someone close to you who is right now in the middle of a sin that they can't get rid of, that they can't escape from, if you fall in any one of those categories, just please come up for prayer. They're going to be up here for a little bit. We're going to be singing. Then after we get done with all this, we'll be moving into a time of giving. I know I ran long today, and I'm sorry, but this doesn't need to be something that stops. So if we wouldn't mind standing, and if you just need prayer for anything involving moral failure or sin, we have people up here ready to pray for you.